All right. I'm gonna sign out.
We'll wait a little after 6 for people to sign in. Give them time. So, Jonathan, are you in DC? Both you and
Yeah,
Aaron, and you
yeah,
all of
yeah.
you are in DC then at this
Mm-hmm.
point. Yeah. Oh, so for the audience Q&A, what's going to happen is that I'm going to ask people to send any questions they have to our HKSNEAA Gmail, and I will be looking at my phone in terms of that, just so you know, during the Q&A, audience Q&A. When we can direct it, people can be fairly flexible in terms of answering those questions or jumping in. That's fine.
Let's just give it a little more time before we start. I can see that we still have people filing in.
Yeah, we could to like 6:05 or so, a few minutes, maybe a little less.
Okay.
But what are we doing for numbers?
We've got about
180.
190, 200 people here so far, and just
Yeah, I'll be
and
interested
we're
because
live.
we did
Yeah.
have we crested over 1,000 registrations today, so it'll be interesting how many people actually tune in after that. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give folks a few minutes to tune in and sign in, and then we'll get started a little bit after 6 in a few minutes.
Mm.
Well, welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. We will have additional folks filing in as we get started here. But thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Rob Werner. I'm a director of the Harvard Kennedy School New England Alumni Association. I'm very pleased to offer this very timely program as we are 1 week away from Inauguration Day. I do want to acknowledge the number of partners that have made this evening and this session possible tonight. Of course, it is ourselves, Harvard Kennedy School New England Alumni Association, the Harvard Kennedy School Washington, D.C. Alumni Council, Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center in Media, Politics, and Public Policy, Harvard Law School Massachusetts Alumni Association, and the Harvard Law School Association of Washington, D.C. So I want to thank our partners very much and for your efforts to promote this program over the last number of days. We are now less than 1 week away from inauguration, as we said at the top, and a transition to a new administration. Our panelists will provide some perspective and insights on what to expect, key issues and trends, and how the White House and Congress will shape policy and politics in 2025. I will say that as we move along with the program, if folks have questions, if you would kindly send them to our email at hksneaa@gmail.com. That's again, hksneaa@gmail.com. So we'll be monitoring those accounts for our Q&A towards the end of the program, the second part of the program. I do want to say a word about the Harvard Kennedy School New England Alumni Association. We are very proud to have been recognized as the winner of the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Network Engagement Award in 2024. And our mission, as we share with many of our partners, is to foster a community of its alumni, to continue the school's public service mission through programming that inspires graduates to expand their knowledge, network, and impact on the world. So thank you for all of that that you do out in the world. I'm going to turn it over to Natalie Brand, who actually is a member of the Harvard Kennedy School, Washington, D.C. Alumni Council and a proud graduate of Harvard Kennedy School. A few words about Natalie before I turn it over to her, and she'll introduce our wonderful panelists. Thanks again for joining us and taking the time. Award-winning journalist Natalie Brand covers the White House and Capitol Hill for CBS News and stations in Washington as a Washington, D.C. based correspondent. As I said, she graduated from HKS mid-career MPA program in 2015, just in time to cover the wild and historic 2016 presidential campaign as a political reporter for KING5 in Seattle. She moved to Washington, D.C. after the midterms in 2018, just in time to cover a record government shutdown for CBS. She's covered almost every major breaking political news event since, including the January 6, 2021 Capitol insurrection, where she provided 24 hours of continuous coverage for CBS stations. Brand covered the 2020 campaign season extensively with a series of enterprise reports from the farms in Iowa to coal country in Pennsylvania. She covered trends including the increasing power of the Latino vote, as well as concerns over election disinformation. Brand's reporting has earned her a Regional Emmy Award for Best Political Reporting coverage for coverage of the 2016 campaign, as well as an Edward R. Murrow Regional Award and 2 Associated Press Awards for breaking news. So Natalie, take it away. Thanks again for joining us, and particularly to the DC Alumni Council of HKS for partnering with us on this program.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I know our time is short tonight. We are lucky to have these panelists on such a busy news day week. So I'll get straight to panelist introductions. Kimberly Atkins-Storr is a senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe with more than 20 years covering politics, policy, and law. You may also recognize her as a political analyst for MSNBC. She's a regular panelist on Meet the Press and co-host of the legal news podcast Sisters-in-Law. And most recently, she launched the podcast Justice by Design. Before pivoting to journalism, Kimberly was a civil trial attorney in Boston. Anna Palmer is a founder and CEO of Punchbowl News. My husband, who's also an HKS alum, currently works on the Hill as a Coast Guard fellow, will tell you that is must-read material for staffers, members, also fellow reporters. We're trying to chase your scoops. Anna and fellow Punchbowl founder Jake Sherman also together authored The Hill to Die On, The Battle for Congress and the Future of Trump's America. And Jonathan Martin is the politics bureau chief at Politico, where he's also the senior political columnist as of 2022, when he started his own column. You probably also know him from his excellent work at the New York Times, serving as a top political reporter for nearly a decade. And he was a co-author of This Will Not Pass, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future about the 2020 election. So thank you again for joining during such a busy time. I want to start by just getting a couple minutes each, your thoughts, where we are headed, I guess starting next week, although it feels like the second Trump term has already begun with just the flood of news and headlines that we've been trying to triage. So I will open it up to the floor and go ahead, share your thoughts, what you're expecting. We'll start with Kimberly.
Well, I think in this case, very unlike 8 years ago, although I think we knew more than we gave ourselves credit for knowing at this time in 2017, we have, as journalists, certainly watched Donald Trump for a decade now, and we should understand and know how he moves. He's somebody who can be, that you are foolish to underestimate, foolish not to take seriously. And he has been pretty consistent when it comes to most policies, if only changing to shift further to the right on most things. And so he's also surrounded this time by a lot of people who have been planning for this. It's not the ad hoc kind of free-for-all as it was in the early days of the Trump administration, when you'd call someone on their cell phone and they'd pass their phone to somebody else in the office. In those early days, now it's an entire well-prepared machine of an administration coming in, and with control of both Congresses ready to back him up. I mean, you can see how quickly, for example, the chatter a few weeks ago about Pete Hegseth likely having confirmation trouble, to fast forward to today, where that doesn't seem to be the case at all. So as a journalist, I am looking at this clearly, keeping in mind the 10 years of knowledge that we've learned for Donald Trump, and planning on reporting and opining. Yes, I'm an opinion reporter, but I still report in a way that doesn't normalize, doesn't scene wash, and doesn't not give the proper context for what's going on, just because it's very easy to go back to muscle memory and cover this White House and Congress as if it were 20 years ago. It's not. So that's really where my mind is as I'm heading into it.
Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me tonight, and agree with a lot of what Kimberly said, in particular that kind of we've seen where President-elect Donald Trump is on a lot of policies. He says what he means, he does, and then he's going to try to move forward with it. I think just a couple of top level things that I think we are dealing with from 100,000-foot level. I think the chaos is back. Right. We have had kind of 4 years of Biden, which was really a return to, kind of press releases and putting news out in a really kind of methodical fashion. And, we have a lot of reporters that didn't cover Trump last time around that work for us now, and just kind of the level of chaos and incoming as reporters and as news organizations trying to understand what is, the signal from the noise is really important. I think there's a huge change, though, in terms of how Washington is approaching Trump 2.0. I think in terms of just looking at the legislative body, which is really what we focus on at Punchbowl News, is what happens in the Capitol, right? Nearly 70% of House Republicans are Trump Republicans, or people that have been elected in the vein, with him as the real de facto leader of the Republican Party. And so you have that, and then you have a Senate that is much more in line. There's a lot fewer of the kind of more traditional Senate Republicans, establishment Republicans, as we think about them, that maybe would oppose or stand up to or not be in line with kind of a lot of what Trump is trying to push through. And so you're going to see a much more eager Congress to do the will of Donald Trump. And I think the third thing I would say is, if you look at the cabinet, which is what we're super focused on this week, it's when all of these big hearings are happening. is, when you look at the first term for Trump, especially in the beginning, he wanted people to challenge him. He was picking people that looked like they were maybe more in central casting, right? People that would seem like they should be Rex Tillerson, in that position, wanting to have generals really kind of, be in his cabinet, kind of this historical kind of, military brand. Fealty is what Donald Trump wants when it comes to his cabinet nominees. We're seeing that across the board, and you're seeing a lot of nominees get the Trump religion in some ways, in terms of even a Marco Rubio, who will get widely, pass his votes, will get some garner some votes from Democrats, but he's having to deal with the fact that he's in a different place personally than Donald Trump is when it comes to a lot of foreign policy. So those are kind of some of my top line thoughts. We'll get into a lot of that, more than that, but that's hopefully kind of tease up where we see Washington vis-a-vis Trump. Can certainly talk about the private sector too, but we'll maybe get into questions on that as well.
Jonathan.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks for having me, Rob. Great to be with the HKS family. My wife Betsy and I were fellows at the IOP in the fall of 23, and just had such a fun time and incredible memories living in Cambridge, and can testify to the charms of the Kennedy School and the kind of the weekly buffet of incredible speakers and events at the Kennedy School. I know all you guys have fond memories of that as well. Look, what we struggle with on Trump, I think, in the press corps, and really in both parties, and have for almost a decade now, is that question of, do you take him literally or seriously? We obviously have to take him seriously. He's a second-term president. He roared back to the nomination of his party and the presidency after being left for dead politically. He is as resilient a figure as any that we've covered in modern America. What we don't necessarily know, and we'll find out real soon, is how literally to take him. And I can cite any number of issues. You guys know what they are. Let's take the territorial expansion, which he didn't mention during the campaign, but obviously has become central in the last few weeks. Does Trump really want to take over Greenland? Is he going to send the 101st Airborne to Greenland and sort of get into a hot war with Denmark? Probably not. Would the Danes be smart to preemptively go to Trump and say, hey, why don't we have a discussion about maybe adding to the U.S. military footprint in Greenland? We're already there. Maybe we could add submarine base there, additional airfield or something. Maybe we'll call it Fort Trump. Throw in some condos. I'm kidding about that part. But, spice it up a little bit. Would Trump then declare victory, go for a big ribbon cutting? Probably. I mean, the question is, how much of this is an opening gambit? How much of it is he actually going to pursue? Also, just real fast, on the issue of tariffs, maybe the biggest question mark, I would say, looming over Trump too. He personally is so invested in a tariff regime. Today he comes out and says he wants to create a Department of External Revenue to go along with the Internal Revenue Service. What does that mean? He's talking about tariffs and customs that we're going to go after with foreign goods. And again, the market hasn't taken him literally on this. They don't believe he's going to pursue a real tariff regime. Let's see what he does starting next week. If he does enact serious wide-scale tariffs, I can tell you the market is going to finally respond, and they're going to take it damn literally, and it's not going to be pretty. And we'll see what Trump's reaction is at that point. Trump is so wedded to the tariffs. He believes so deeply in tariffs. He says that tariff is the prettiest word in the English language. We also know from experience, though, that Trump is really conditioned and shaped and checked, if we're being totally honest, by two factors: the press coverage and the stock market. And boy, if the stock market collapses when those tariffs go into effect and the press coverage follows, that's going to be fascinating to see how Trump reacts, because he'll be torn between the coverage in the markets and the tariffs he loves. So those are just a couple of issues. But I think it gets back to the central question of how much is this to be taken seriously versus literally? How much is he going through with? We'll find out real soon.
And to start with a point of personal privilege, to start with a journalism question, starting back in 2015, journalists struggled to figure out how to cover Trump. Same story during his first administration. What do you think reporters have learned? How do you think coverage in the second administration could be different compared to when, you know, a tweet in the middle of the night could upend the news cycle the next morning?
For me or for
I'll open it up to the floor.
I mean, I think one of the things that we've learned is that Trump is the arbiter. This is a one-man act. And the traditional coverage of, well, the OMB is putting together the blueprint for fiscal year 2027. You know, that stuff just doesn't matter as much anymore. And there is this muscle memory in so much of the Washington press corps that you cover presidents a certain way, and that you had, look, it's going to be the president's annual budget proposal. The documents are coming over from OMB, and this is going to be a huge day. And it's like, you know, no, like we don't have to do that. We shouldn't do that. And you have to cover Trump for what he is. And you can't force him into being a traditional president and cover him like one, because he's not. And if you do that, you're actually doing a disservice to your readers, I think.
Any other thoughts,
Yeah,
Kimberly or Anna?
Yeah, I also would point out what's different now is the media landscape and the way
No.
that news is consumed, so much of it. I mean, here in Washington, the impending new administration and how to cover it has completely upended that landscape. You're seeing a plethora of new independent news organizations forming. You're seeing a big shift in the public's perception of institutions like the Post and the Times and others. You know, Jake and Anna were way ahead of the game in like breaking out on the independent way, just because of the way you're seeing news organizations really fall behind an ethos. Like either we are going to cover the heck out of Congress and, you know, be on top of everything, or we are going to focus on the creep of authoritarianism, or we're going to focus on individual rights. I mean, we are seeing journalists try to find new ways, in part because the old ways didn't seem to be working very well. And the even before the actions of some newspaper publishers made headlines, people really weren't feeling like they were getting what they needed, and they were speaking up. So I think you're still seeing news organizations reckon with that. Another thing is very different is the direct threat on journalists and news organizations. I mean, I and probably everybody on this set have had meetings about how to protect ourselves, what our legal rights are, what our, you know, how to ensure, you know, what to do if we're subpoenaed. I mean, it's just an entirely different landscape than it was 8 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just to kind of piggyback on what J Mart was saying. I mean, I do think Trump is a singular person, and as much as, and I think this is something we struggle with in the first administration, is, you know, what might be true in an aide might be trying to tell you exactly what they think is what they left the meeting, what the plan was going to be. It can change in 2 minutes. Because, you know, the only person that matters is Donald Trump. I mean, we saw this over and over again in tax reform, right? When Steven Mnuchin was cutting a deal, had the authority of the president, and then all of a sudden Trump went a different way. And so I think we expect that, but it's a very different world to operate in, and it's a hard world to report in because, you know, things are kind of being thrown at the wall like spaghetti, and what sticks and what doesn't. And so I think that makes it really difficult to kind of to report on it, because we are used to kind of gathering information from people, and, you know, things are moving at a lot slower pace. You know, for us, I think it's an interesting challenge. We really focus on the Capitol. There's going to be a ton of need for Trump to work with this House Republicans and the Senate to get his agenda accomplished beyond what he can do by executive order. And there's a lot of new faces here. And so we're kind of figuring out that challenge now, I think, as we figure out what happens with kind of some of the lower level positions underneath cabinet secretaries as well.
Yeah. And to kind of segue into the next question, Anna, on Capitol Hill, how do you anticipate some of these big legislative fights playing out with narrow margins, you know, in the Senate and the House? Already so much talk about this reconciliation bill, trying to cram in taxes, border, energy. Who on Capitol Hill should we be watching? Who might, you know, stand up to Trump, and how do you weeks and months?
It's a great question. I mean, we spent a lot of time thinking about that. I mean, I would say Republicans' best day is going to be January 20th. They're going to have a huge weekend of party and bringing everybody together, and clearly a lot of celebrating. And then things shift really quickly, right? And in particular, when it comes to the Congress and the numbers in the House, Republicans are only going to have a 1-seat majority, right? I also think we saw that fealty to Trump is not necessarily, going to be, members aren't just going to go along to get along, right? We saw that with the government funding fight. 38 Republicans did not vote for what Donald Trump expressly asked them to. You have a speaker who's super weak, right? Basically wasn't going to get the speakership until 2 House Freedom Caucus members changed their vote after getting on the phone with Trump. Like, how long does that last? And so I think there is some real challenges that you have in Speaker Mike Johnson, who doesn't come with a lot of the experience that a traditional speaker would have. You also have a new Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, who's done quite a bit of work to repair his relationship with Trump world, but is certainly not a kind of Trump sycophant by any stretch of the imagination. We're already starting to see, right? They still can't decide, is it 1 bill or is it 2 reconciliation bills? How are they going to pass a budget resolution? I mean, there's a lot of details. As much as like it sounds great, this is going to take, I assume, always take the over on Congress most of this year until the deadline of these tax cuts expiring to actually get done.
And then on a more optimistic note, any issues that you think could gain bipartisan momentum? I mean, drug price, there have been things talked about. What realistically, where do you see?
Well, this
Democrats
first bill, right,
potentially-
Anna, the immigration bill, the Lake and Riley
That's
Act
true.
that stiffens penalties on the undocumented who commit crimes, basically expedites their deportation. You got significant votes from House Democrats. I think you'll get in the double digits of Senate Democrats. And that's probably a conservative estimate when this thing passes the Senate. I think Democrats are trying to get to the right on immigration and trying to accommodate what they see as their challenge on the issue. And if that means voting for this bill, then they're going to do it. At least a lot of them.
I think that's right.
I would
Another
say
question-
more
go ahead.
broadly, one thing to look out for with Democrats, though, is that there is currently a debate within. They have to decide whether they are going to act as an opposition party or not. And so then the name of the game, or the way that some Democrats want the party to move, is that bipartisanship isn't the goal. The goal is holding the line against what they see is bad policy, and so I think it's important to frame this in the right way, and again, that muscle memory that you think, and necessarily because it's bipartisan, it's good. A lot of Democrats are hearing from their constituents who don't feel that way, so that it will also be interesting to see to what extent Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer really hold the line.
Another question for the larger group. How do you view President-elect Trump's approach, mentality towards Washington changing this time around? He's more confident in Washington, the executive branch, his movement, this time it's not kind of perceived as a fluke. How is that going to shape his approach to the White House, and how are we already seeing it play out in his cabinet picks?
It's such a great question, Natalie, because the first time around, he got buffaloed into appointing people into his White House and his cabinet that he didn't really want, that were kind of foisted on him. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell were still traditional Republicans, and there was a unspoken, or in some quarters spoken, hope that this is kind of an aberration. This is still the traditional party, and we'll get it back here before long. Anybody believes that anymore? He picked the cabinet he wanted to pick. He's appointed the folks around him in the West Wing that he wants. And there's just not many folks that are going to check him. I mentioned the stock market and the press coverage. To me, those are the 2 biggest drivers that check him. It's certainly not going to be the folks around him. So, yeah, this is a more unbridled Trump. It's a more confident, emboldened Trump. And I think he's going to act on that, in part because, he knows where the bathrooms are in the West Wing. He understands more the ebb and the flow of this job. And I think the congressional Republicans would hope that that experience would make him more patient. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think he's going to be more patient. I think he's going to be just as sort of eager and impatient to get stuff done. But this time, I think with more confidence about how Washington works and how politics works.
And Anna, today we saw, obviously, we were all watching the confirmation hearing of Pete Hegseth, who I believe also attended Kennedy School. You know, fiery questioning by Democrats, pretty friendly questioning by Republicans. You know, Joni Ernst, everyone's keeping an eye on her. But how would you analyze the confirmation hearing that we saw today and kind of what it could say about the other nominees who will be going through these hearings?
Senate Republicans, and maybe I would just say Senate Republicans, I think I mean, I think what it showed is that they are falling in line behind what Donald Trump wants as his cabinet. I think we've seen that over and over again, whether, you know, Senator John Cornyn and others have said, might not be who I would pick, but this is the president, he was elected, this is the cabinet that he wants. And I think Hegseth, to me, you know, I think there's a couple others. There's Kash Patel, there's Tulsi Gabbard, there's RFK Jr. There's going to be some others that will be interesting to see where people end up. I think Republicans unified around Hegseth in a way to say that the Democrats are just trying to Brett Kavanaugh him. That was truly the kind of, and that
Totally.
was, I think, and that was a salient point for them, that then they were able to just kind of move past a lot of the allegations on sexual assault. I think the Democrats it was a tougher hearing than I expected by members on the Democratic side, Tim Kaine and others, than I think that came out really swinging for it. But I don't think any minds or hearts were moved on the Republican side. I think they already scheduled a vote for it this week.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I think that rallying effect, it's so tribal. And once they're circling around, you know, our guy, we got to defend our guy. And yeah, I think the fresh memories of what they view as the mistreatment of Kavanaugh. And also, I think they're almost desensitized to a lot of those charges, not just because Kavanaugh, but because Trump too. And that's why there's a sort of rallying effect. And also, for being totally candid, they're intimidated. Look what happened to Joni Ernst in December. You know, she expressed some misgivings about Hegseth. She got immense blowback.
Right.
And so I think part of this is the MAGA intimidation, explicit and implicit. They don't want to get crosswise with the president. Policy does not matter. Fealty does. And you got to line up and support the president no matter the issues. Look at what happened in the House last week. You have a bunch of hardline conservatives who are traditional small government folks. They don't want to vote for Mike Johnson for speaker. But once it became a test of loyalty about Donald Trump and not about Mike Johnson, ball game. That was it. Because their voters at home in the primary don't give two figs about small government principles. They care about, are you for our guy, Trump, or not? And if you're not, you're in trouble politically.
Kimberly, how do you view the courts preparing for a second Trump term? I know, you know, during his first administration, we just saw a barrage of lawsuits, especially by Democratic attorneys general across the country who, you know, this time around are also saying they're preparing to challenge him on certain issues. What will you be watching from the legal perspective?
Well, during his first administration, when it comes to challenges brought by state AGs over policies involving, those would be things involving Medicare coverage or trying to limit ACA coverage. States usually respond by filing suit on behalf of their citizens in those cases. And we saw a very active number of state attorneys generals doing that. But the Supreme Court, for the most part, when you tallied it all up at the end, Donald Trump had a much better record. His administration had a better record against such challenges than the Democratic presidents who came before him. I mean, in the Obama administration, policies were struck down left, right, and center. Obamacare was really the biggest outlier in that, which went to the Supreme Court like 4 different times on 4 different postures, but still survived largely intact. Donald Trump was already coming in with a better record. He's coming in with 3 justices that he appointed and a tremendous number of judges at the federal and appellate level that he also appointed. Yes, Joe Biden appointed even more, but Joe Biden started with a very rightward leaning ideological judiciary. But I think what I'm looking for most of all from the courts is what the immunity decision for private citizen Trump, as well as technically a loss on Trump's attempt to stop his sentencing from the court. But the court basically said, listen, this trial judge is only going to slap you on the wrist, so get out of here. There's nothing for us to do. It's that kind of dynamic, the dynamic that Trump and a justice of the Supreme Court feel perfectly comfortable chit-chatting with each other on the phone in an ex parte communication, even though there are challenges before the court right now that he's involved in. Makes me wonder how different this court is going to treat his administration now. I think those are open questions. I think we will begin to see that with some of the cases that come up with the administration challenges to his early executive actions. And I think those will be some really important tea leaves to read. But by and large, I expect this court not to be very much of a backstop to his administration, if that's what some people on the left are looking for.
Since we have your legal perspective, thoughts on the portion of the special counsel Jack Smith's report that was released overnight. And, I guess the takeaway is that chapter closes, but also the question of what happens to the pending January 6th prosecutions.
So there are still a couple hundred pending prosecutions that have worked their way through. This is on top of the 1,400, I believe, convictions that have already been secured of the January 6th rioters. But Donald Trump, who, in my opinion, loves to beat down the rule of law every chance he gets, is promising to pardon most or all, or who knows how many of them. That will have a tremendous, in my opinion, negative impact on the rule of law and the trust that people have in institutions. Jack Smith's report, it didn't tell us anything that the January 6th committee didn't tell us, and what his indictment didn't already tell us. The only thing new was him formally expressing his confidence that he would have been convicted had he not run out the clock every way he could, including with the help of the US Supreme Court. So I think it's sad that we already knew all these things, but here we are still in this place where we are after the election.
Being a reporter in Washington, D.C. now, I know that, sometimes it feels like we're driven by the big headlines. Sometimes it can kind of feel like insider baseball, in the Beltway. When you step outside of Washington, D.C. to state and local jurisdictions, where I was also a reporter, the stories become much more about the impact on the ground, the impact of policies and how they play into these communities. What are you watching in trying to do some reporting outside of Washington, D.C.? How do you think individual states and just different groups, are preparing for the Trump presidency? And, what are you watching in terms of movements and actions there? Red and blue states.
Well, there's dissidence in the Democratic Party on how to handle Trump. There's not the clarity from 2016 in which there was this immediate sort of to the barricades moment in the Democratic Party in progressive circles of this man must be stopped. It's more like to the bar for Democrats the last couple of months. They're trying to not think about this and ignore it. You've seen that in the dip in television ratings, especially on MSNBC. It's like a person's favorite sports team losing. Like they don't want to listen to the talk radio the next day. It's depressing. And I think the question to me is, what are Democrats going to do? They're not going to be the post 2016 resistance, but some will try to obviously take that tack. But I think most of them are still trying to figure it out, guys, over 2 months since the election. And we don't have an answer yet. What's the middle ground between all-out resistance and capitulation? To be totally candid, I think some Democrats are looking to Trump for answers, and they're going to see how he governs. And I think the private hope among Democrats is he'll just botch things, and it'll be a complete shit show, which is a term I know that they teach at HKS in the poli-sci programs there. But you know, this kind of misrule, incompetence, excess will just make this easy on Democrats. They don't have to oppose. They just have to simply point a finger and say, "Are you tired yet of that?" And in fact, they'll run the same campaign in 28 that the Republicans did in 24, which is had enough. So I think the short answer is Democrats aren't sure where they are, either in DC or state capitals or city halls, and they're kind of waiting to see how Trump governs to gauge their own response.
Yeah. And this week, we've already seen some of the continued back and forth between Trump and Governor Newsom in California, who, of course, California dealing with these tragic wildfires. Right. Who else from a Democratic governor point of view are you watching? Are you paying attention to?
J.B. Pritzker, certainly, who has, you know, I think offered more sort of resistance type language as the governor of Illinois, you know, one of the biggest blue cities in the country, obviously Chicago, where he lives. I think he's interesting to watch. I think the two neighbors here in the East, Wes Moore in Maryland and Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, who are ambitious fellows who may have aspirations to run in 2028. How do they handle Trump? I think that's going to be really interesting to watch. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan on her way out in 26, but I think similarly interesting to watch how she handles Trump vis-a-vis what she wants to do going forward.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no, you go, Anna. Go ahead.
No, you please.
Or go, Natalie. Sorry. I have been looking at things on the more local level, not so much looking at the leaders, but listening to the people and trying to get a sense of the issues that may bubble up and may become part of those AG challenges that we talked about before, state efforts to push back on policies. I mean, I'm hearing people in blue states worried about having to try to get someone to get estrogen for them in case they no longer have access for that for their trans teens. They are worried that you know, about warning their families not to use menstrual cycle tracking apps on their phones because they're fearful of being interfered with. They're worried about their kids being safe at school if vaccination requirements are lifted. This is what people in states that I have been talking to are worried about. We've heard a lot of this coming from folks in red states where state action has, you know, put reproductive access or other things in peril, voting rights, LGBTQ rights in peril. Now you see people in the blue states worried about what the feds will do. So I think that will be a driver about what the leaders do, how the leaders in those states respond, and the ripples of that from Washington.
Before we open it up for audience questions, and I want to ask you what you're watching outside of Washington, D.C., especially as it relates to upcoming midterms, which we'll be talking about soon.
It's a good question. I mean, listen, I think I'm really, and I think Jamie kind of put a fine point on this. Like, I think we don't know what Democrats, what their final lessons are going to be here, right? And oftentimes the lessons that parties take when they lose aren't necessarily the right lessons. And so I think we are watching really carefully, how do Democrats handle things like immigration? How do they handle things like the economy? You've started to see some of these folks talk about, you know, whether it's Gottheimer in New Jersey. I mean, the first thing he said it was talking about cutting taxes, right? They're starting to sound a lot more like Republicans on some of these issues. And I think that to me is going to be one of the big things that is going to matter. I'm personally, I think Kimberly, I'm just obsessed with AGs. I think they're so powerful. I think particularly now, you know, do you see for the last 4 years, we've talked so much about how Republican AGs in some of these states were really putting the fire to the Biden administration. Do Democratic AGs, are they able to galvanize in the same way? I think that to me is also something that's highly undercovered, not our focus, but just personally, I think those fights start there and then become really big issues at the national level.
Rob, I'm going to toss it to you to introduce some audience questions.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for your insights, everyone. We do have a number of questions. I do have some questions to start off with as well. So one of the things we wanted to dig in a little bit about is this whole aspect of the Trump agenda in terms of how it gets presented. Reconciliation bill, this is sort of, not everyone knows what that is, but many do. In terms of all these options, all these policies getting into one bill, whether it's two bills, one bill, how is all that going to shake out? And of course, we know that the parliamentarian of Congress and Senate has a lot to say about what can go into that kind of vehicle. How germane is it to budgetary aspects? And so I think there's a big push of trying to get as much stuff as possible into this bill at the front end of Congress. How is that all going to shake out?
I mean, that's the $10 million question, billion dollar question. I can start. This is what we focus a lot on, and I'm sure Jonathan has, and Kimberly might have some other thoughts. But I mean, from my perspective, listen, I think we don't know how this shakes out. The problem for Republicans right now is they're not unified on a strategy. You have the one big, beautiful bill that Donald Trump wants, right? Which is the idea he's kind of gone with, which is the Speaker Mike Johnson theory of the case. The House really only has the kind of ability to pass one reconciliation package. And versus Senator John Thune, who said, let's do two packages. Let's get some early wins in. Let's focus on immigration. Let's focus on energy, and then deal with all of these taxes. The fact that we're still talking about that, the fact that there's still question about that, it just pushes this whole process back further and further. I think the other big point, I think it's an important one you made, is that there's not gonna be a lot of other things that happen. There's not gonna be a ton of bipartisanship on a bunch of different things. This is gonna be the big package of this year, and I think there's going to be a huge push by Republicans to get things like permitting reform and other things that the parliamentarian in previous iterations has said you cannot include in reconciliation. And so I would expect to see many test balloons, as many as possible, for them to try to get what they want done here. Then they will kind of be pushed back. Thune has said that they're going to abide by the parliamentarian, and I think there will be very big pressure on that by Republicans if it becomes a much more narrow package. So those are some of the two dynamics. I really don't think we just don't know right now. I think it's a moving target on even what the process looks like. And you have to remember, and I'm like, go back to process, because that's what actually matters on the Hill, is they also have to pass a budget resolution. And in the last time they did this, when Trump, the tax cuts happened, they did this, they'd already passed a budget resolution by today. They haven't even started to draft it. So things are already starting to slip.
Always assume that it's going to take longer than you thought when it comes to Congress. This is going to be the Mike Johnson, John Thune challenge. Trump is not going to have any patience for a delay. And they have a no-seat majority in the House and just a couple basically in the Senate. I just have a hard time seeing how they're going to come to a resolution, whether they do one bill or two bills on taxes, especially anytime soon, given the challenge. Trump wants to sign something, all right? But the challenge with Trump just wanted to sign something is, it means he doesn't offer clarity to Congress. And Congress wants clarity on both substance and process, how to move. And until Trump gives that, they're going to be paralyzed. I mean, I mentioned this about the speaker vote. Their party is dictated by fealty toward Donald Trump. And when he doesn't offer direction, like he did on Mike Johnson, then it kind of gums up the work. So ultimately, guys, Trump is going to have a problem here of his own making, and he's going to have nobody to blame but himself. Now, Donald Trump's never going to blame himself. He'll take out Johnson and Thune, but this is going to be a huge challenge to get something passed on taxes, and I have a hard time seeing it happen anytime soon, if it can happen at all in calendar year 25.
Kim, do you have a comment on this aspect?
No, my job is to wait and see how it plays out and then make it make sense. So I don't have to predict.
Okay. Another question has to do with the department of well, it is not a formal department because it has to be created by Congress, but Department of government efficiency, Doge, how with Mr. Ramaswamy and Mr. Musk, what are you guys hearing about that? How's that going to affect things in this next Congress and Congress's work, do you think?
Cutting spending is always very difficult. I think that what they have done really effectively is this kind of messaging, right? I mean, the idea that lawmakers want to cut fat from some of these programs is not new. It's kind of given a vehicle and energy for Republicans to put all of those kind of thoughts in one spot. But they don't have any actual authority. So I think the question is going to be, they can make a lot of recommendations, but are they really going to go to where the cutting probably needs to happen to make a significant changes? I mean, that's talking Social Security, that's talking Medicare, that's talking about a lot of things that are really, really thorny. So I think that it will take up energy and space, and there might be some efforts. But I think as far as the ability, I mean, you have to remember, there's only so many things that they can do. What really animates Donald Trump? He's never cared about deficits. He's never cared about the debt. Republicans used to talk about that all the time, but when he came into power, that kind of stopped being part of their talking points. So he cares about immigration. He cares about the border. He cares about, go back to what he talks about. And that's where I think he's going to spend a lot more of his personal political capital versus like trying to cut programs.
Donald Trump has never been interested in cutting spending. In fact, just the opposite. Like he wants to use government to spend more money on his favorite interest. I mean, but don't forget, at the end of his administration, he was eager to put his name on the COVID relief checks, and then was like, "Why are we being so stingy? Let's give him more money. Let's spend some more, man. Get those reserves working here." So I think it's a total mismatch. Like, show me where Donald Trump cares about tightening, fiscal spending. And he famously ran against cutting entitlements. In fact, part of the reason why he's president is because he was a real out loud advocate against cutting entitlements, which sort of separated him from the Paul Ryan traditionalist wing of the Republican Party. So I think the Trump-Elon bromance is going to come to an end here at some point, in large part because, like I said earlier, the Trump act's a one-man play, but also because the inherent contradiction of cutting spending. Like Trump doesn't want to do that, and members of Congress have their sacred cows, and somebody's one man's waste is somebody else's important investment. So I just have a hard time seeing that thing last.
Jonathan, since you've covered so many of the campaign officials, wondering how you think Susie Wiles' approach or impact on Trump, how that's going to play out as chief of staff.
Well, I think Trump respects her. I think winning put capital in her bank, both the primary without a sweat, and then obviously a convincing win in the general election. Trump cares about winning and the perception of winning, and so he views her as a winner because he won. I think that helps her a lot. I don't think ultimately she's going to have control over what Trump says and does, because nobody does, and nobody has ever had that kind of control. So I think ultimately he's ungovernable and unmanageable. That's not opinion, that's just born of facts and precedent. And so I think she'll have an enormous challenge on her hands. But I don't think anybody else could do the job remotely as well as she could, given the last 16 months and what happened on the campaign and the capital and the bank she got from that. So she'll be able to restrain him at times more than most, but I don't think ultimately Trump is restrainable. And so that's going to be a challenge for her. But can she channel him rather in ways that are productive, at least for the first year and a half of his second term here? It'll be fascinating to watch.
Foreign policy question to shift a little bit. How do you think the administration is going to position the United States on the world stage, and how is Congress going to react to that? For example, I got a question here about we've been hearing the last day or so about a possible ceasefire in Gaza. But how is we know that the President-elect Trump has said it better end by the time I put my hand on that Bible. And we've got Ukraine, we've got many other crisis points. What's your view of that in terms of the role of the United States in the world? We have a question about that. So.
I think when it comes to Israel, the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration are very much working hand in hand, are in agreement. They want to get a deal done before the inauguration. I think when it comes to Ukraine, I think aid is over. I think money cutting checks was over. I think Republicans were already in that camp. And I think that this kind of strongly solidifies that perspective. I think the question is going to be, we'll see in this Rubio hearing, does he kind of just take on all of Donald Trump's foreign policy prerogatives, or does he continue to have any of his own kind of policies? He certainly has a very well thought out, whether you agree with him or not, kind of perspective on the world. And he'll be going around the world stage. I mean, I think you saw obviously a massive shift from kind of America first to the Biden administration trying to go back to kind of normal diplomatic relations with a lot of folks. I'm sure we'll kind of shift back to the Trumpian way. And I think the one thing that I do think you could see some bipartisanship on is China. I think Republicans and Democrats are very aligned for their different reasons for it. But that is the anti-China sentiment on the Hill, and definitely throughout the Trump administration is extremely high.
It is, Anna, but Trump wants to be a winner and he wants to do big, beautiful deals more than he cares about like confronting the CCP. And he invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration for a reason. He wants to extend an open hand. He wants to do deals. He wants to be seen in the eyes of history as a big, historic, winning, powerful figure. And if you're China, boy. And by the way, Beijing, if you're listening here tonight during the HKS alumni session, I mean, Trump is so eager to do big deals. And like you can see it now, right? The two of them walking along the Great Wall, arm in arm, the cameras running, and they announced like the biggest rapprochement between the two countries since Nixon. And, we're going to call it the Donald J. Trump big, beautiful deal with China of 2025 or 2026. And we'll throw in some Trump condos in Shanghai to, make it even. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but like, I just think Trump's open for business. I don't care about any of the rhetoric, the hawkishness on the Hill, totally right. But he's going to do what he's going to do. And if you don't believe me, I can pull up a picture here of Trump and Kim Jong-un literally walking arm in arm across the DMZ. I mean, give me a break, right? Like, can you imagine any other Republican president getting away with that? But he did, and he will again.
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump's foreign policy has been and will continue to be informed by two things, as J. Mart was saying, the desire to look like a grand deal maker, right? I was in Beijing during the trade wars of the first administration, and it was getting such Trump's trade war with China was getting such headlines in Washington, and over there the officials and everybody else was just like, we don't care, like he can he doesn't scare us, like whatever, like he's not going to win a trade war with us, let him bloviate. But then at the same time, he also likes strongmen. So yeah, he's gonna walk,
Totally.
He's gonna walk along the beach with Xi Jinping because he loves that. He's gonna be like, hey, can you do one of those military parades? Because I love those. I mean, that explains his foreign policy. Sometimes they will come, cause vacillations, like with China. It's like both the, adoration of the strong man as well as the desire to look like a big tough guy who's gonna impose tariffs. Sometimes it will be very strange bedfellows. I mean, the first time it was Kim Jong-un. Who knows who it will be this time? I think, but if you keep those two interests in mind, you'll get a good idea where he's likely to go.
Shifting back a little bit to domestic concerns, we've gotten a number of questions about the position of career civil servants and all of that sort of threat of we're going to go into agencies and find our loyalists, and we're going to switch people around in categories so they can more easily find out, what their attitudes are and so forth, and maybe deal with that. So there is concern about that. There certainly was rhetoric about that during the campaign. How do you see that realistically being implemented and playing out?
We're already seeing the impacts of it, right? I mean, so many people who I know who have worked for the federal government for decades are already out. You know, they were already making their exit plans even before the election. And, you know, a lot of them are very sad about it because they believed in the work that they did very much. But when, you know, a nice, healthy check in the private sector awaits and you can protect yourself and your family, that's where they go. I mean, some of them are worried about them now coming under attack and even, you know, being prosecuted or having other problems with this new administration. So just the threat of it has already been created an immense brain drain in lots of places within the federal government. So I don't think it will be as hard as people think it is, and who knows what guidelines DOJ will use to decide who gets to go. But, you know, it's already having an impact.
Other comments? What about energy policy and the kinds of initiatives that were followed by the Biden administration and the tax credits for energy and those investments and sort of all of the stuff that was in the IRA? How does that play out? And part of, personal privilege, I do know that there are a number of Republican members of Congress
Yes.
who support those tax credits. And given the narrow margin, particularly in the House, how does that lay out?
Rob, I know it's an issue of great interest to you, personally and professionally. I think this is something that will be one of those things that is impacted by just the narrowness of the Republican majority, the time crunch they're under, and the scale of what they're trying to do. How in the world are they going to be able to undo a lot of these tax credits for clean energy and sort of gather the votes for doing that when they're trying to do so much else? I think given the political interest of Republicans, especially in red states that have EV facilities, they don't want to lose those credits. I mean, look at Brian Kemp in Georgia. You think he's going to tell his delegation in Congress to get rid of the EV credit when they're using that for jobs? I just think it's an easy soundbite to dump Biden's clean energy credits. It's harder when you start counting the votes to get it done, especially with so much else on their plate. I think on the broader issue of energy, I think Trump and the Congress are basically in the same place. They want to expand drilling and they want to sort of focus on more fossil fuel development. I think that's pretty clear. I think Burgum sails through and is obviously going to be the kind of energy czar focused on doing more domestic production. With that, by the way, guys, I got to scoot. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Rob, good to see you and good to see
good to see you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to getting back to Cambridge soon. See you guys.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Thanks. Take care. Bye. Natalie, do you have additional questions you'd like to ask? I've got to look at some other ones that are coming across the transom.
Yeah. When you think about, the Biden legacy and then transitioning to next leaders of the Democratic Party, Karine Jean-Pierre was asked a question in the briefing this past week about who is the leader, who's the, next leader of the Democratic Party, and she couldn't really answer that. Who are you watching in Congress or, elsewhere? And how do you anticipate, the campaign season ramping up, even as Trump's term is beginning? We're already looking ahead to next election cycles.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I mean, I think, listen, Jeffries in the House is, going to be seen as a next generation leader. It's easy in the House typically to be against the majority when you're in the minority. And so I think you should have a very unified caucus. But I do think when you look at kind of the next generation, I think we look to the governors, of course, and we mentioned a bunch of them in terms of their leadership, but kind of who rises to the top of that list is kind of being the kind of either the antithesis to Trump, but also kind of finding new messaging. I think there's a lot of conversations. We've done a ton of reporting, and kind of Kimberly was talking about this earlier, but like how Democrats are trying to figure out, like, they can't just be reflexively anti-Trump in the way that they were in the first term. I think there's a really strong sentiment there. And, we even quoted, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think last week it was, saying, we just can't just be anti, right? We have to figure out what we're for. And so saying that they might work on them, when we saw this with the Lake and Riley Act, I don't think it's going to be across the board. I think generally you'll see them, kind of being in opposition, but they are really concerned about where they are on the economy, where they are when it comes to some of these other issues that were really salient in the 24 election. And I think there is a real internal kind of moment happening of what the messaging should be, and a generational divide as well. We've seen this a lot play out on Capitol Hill of kind of who's going to be the messenger, what that message should be. And so far, I don't think we have, who's going to be the torchbearer in the way that it was before. I don't think it's going to be Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I think the fact that Democrats don't have a unifying guiding principle, they don't have a lodestar at the moment as to what they are for, that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for a natural leader to emerge. When you have a more unified party, that allows for somebody, who is charismatic to sort of make their way through the way, say, Obama did in the early 2000s. But the Democrats aren't even sure, as Anna said, how to proceed, what posture to take. And so how can you have a leader easily rise from that? Even questions like, will there be another hangover after this election that makes people wary to put forward people of color with the DEI attacks, or women, or everything? Democrats haven't figured any of this out. So it's impossible to know who a leader is. That's, at least for one reason Republicans have been so successful, is that their lodestar, their guiding principle, is Trump. So it makes it very easy for people to fall in line behind him and have him as the lodestar. And I think Trumpism will survive even this Trump administration, because that was such, MAGA was such a easy thing to embrace behind. Democrats don't have that. So that's a tough question to answer.
And in talking, to voters during the campaign cycle, you get the sense we know this, it's no secret, there's just a lot of political fatigue, fatigue around polarization and just kind of the unprecedented levels we've seen over the years. How does that change? Can it change anytime soon? What are you watching, in terms of how to address that?
You got to give people a minute. I mean, we have to understand that, even here in Washington, people cannot be campaign focused and keep up that level of intensity 24/7. And certainly people who are not in Washington are not doing that. People are taking a break from the political information consumption. People who are within the parties are taking a break. Democrats, certainly, there are factors are like, what, I'm going to take some time to make sure that myself and my family are good. I'm going to take some time to figure out how I move next and make changes. I mean, this is a very transitional time. So I'm not even sure we can really draw big conclusions based on what's happened since November. I think it's still early days.
Given all the horrible news coming out of California and Los Angeles in the last number of days, and the fact that we've heard some folks say, well, there need to be conditions in aid somehow, and we're not sure what that means. And how does that all figure into what Congress is going to need to do, and the Trump administration is going to need to do, to pay attention to that issue in short order?
Yeah, I mean, what's happening in California is just, I mean, obviously devastating. So first of all, I think we just have to, your heart goes out to everybody who's lost their homes and just this rebuilding period for an entire city. And then I think the massiveness of it is hard sometimes to even kind of really grapple with when you aren't there. And I think Congress has not put a lot of numbers out there, I think they're trying to, it's obviously an ongoing tragedy. So I think they don't necessarily want to get ahead of what might be needed or what isn't needed. There will clearly have to be a disaster relief package. I would think it largely will go into a government funding bill in March. That is going to be controversial. This Congress and it has been hard to do disaster relief. We saw that in North Carolina. We've seen it in Florida more recently. And so both of those kind of in the more recent times, but it's become politicized in a way that it didn't used to be. And so I think we don't know exactly how that plays out. And Trump clearly has been in a 8-day feud with Gavin Newsom, the governor there, going back and forth. And it's very personal with them. When will Trump go to California and see the state? He's been invited by the governor. That has not happened yet. So I think there's a lot of the optics of that, but Trump has been different than most presidents, right? Where you're in this kind of a natural tragedy. The typical political response is to try to bring the country together, and that's not what Donald Trump does. Or hasn't done in these kinds of tragedies. And certainly we're not seeing that yet today. So I think that will depend. I do think the other thing I would say is I think there's something that's going to happen on insurance. I think you have not just California, but Florida, this idea that, people in these states are only going to be able to self-insure. I mean, that's really as you're just saying wealthy people can buy houses then. If I was the insurance industry, and I think they're clearly understand there's going to be a huge amount of pressure to have some changes there.
And bipartisan support around that, you would think, for sure.
I would hope so, given the crisis of insurance that we know has been developing and it's only going to get worse.
I think beyond what California and how things play out with that will be a bellwether for how Trump and congressional Republicans will sort of weaponize red and blue states, or at least weaponize blue states. Donald Trump campaigned on retribution for those who didn't support him. Like he outwardly said that. So if Republicans follow suit and limit the support based on this Trump-Newsom spat or Trump's views of California, if I were in a blue state, I would be concerned. I would look at that as a sign, as a harbinger. You get some sort of natural disaster, you have some specific economic need. You should not count on Washington for support. I just don't see. Yes, Donald Trump is not a big disaster guy, and he doesn't, fly out and cradle injured children in any situation. But he's been vengeful. I mean, and now in a second term without, the need to run for re-election again, there's no reason to believe he won't be more so. So I'm watching this to see what that could, again, people in blue states who thought that they were safe from the worst of what they see as in Republican policy, that's no longer the case.
Well, I think we're nearing the end of our time together, but what we'd like to do is maybe have you provide some closing thoughts, final thoughts, and perhaps you could reflect a bit on the conversation, questions, and so forth. But what would you have for sort of closing thoughts for us this evening?
I'll go first because Kimberly, I'll let you have the last word. It's been a super interesting conversation. Thank you for having me. I think it's given me a lot to think about as we are less than a week away from the Trump second inauguration. Washington feels like it's already on lockdown. I live on Capitol Hill. I mean, its security is extremely intense. There's barricades everywhere. I think what this conversation has really put a fine point on for me is just what a massive transition we are about to have. I mean, I think we've already started to feel it, but it is going to become really, really intense once Donald Trump is in office, once his cabinet is in office. We're going to see very quickly whether or not he can deliver on the promises that he made during the campaign. And I think the other thing I would say is just, you know, I feel like Kimberly and J Mart and Allie, I mean, we talked a lot about just how difficult it's going to be on the Hill. It's going to be really difficult for him to actually get anything done legislatively. And so I think we are in for, I tell our team all the time, I think we're in for a long 2025 with a lot of twists and turns, and but ultimately really tough kind of conversations are going to have to be had to get what they want to get done.
Yeah, I guess just I echo everything Anna said, and also just from a journalism standpoint, I think we need to be really vigilant. And this is a point too that Anna and J-Mart made, that things are so different, and it will be hard for journalism to sort of recalibrate itself to cover things the way they are now, and but also to try to cover things in new ways. I mean, Jamar brought up the example of, you know, budgets coming, White House budgets, and how those things have never ever passed. But what they used to be is a signal of what the administration's priorities are. Well, you have to look at that in other ways. I know there was a debate about how much attention we should be paying to Donald Trump's Greenland threats, but I wrote a column about it saying, listen, Greenland is a land of predominantly indigenous people. You know, the United States doesn't have a real great track record when it comes to being colonizers. So this, to me, is signaling for Donald Trump that he, the deal maker, the real estate guy, wants to buy communities and wants to buy nations. And as Americans, that signal of his priorities should be something that alarms us. I think we need to be constantly recalibrating ourselves in how we cover this administration while we are, you know, and it's not easy. I mean, sometimes it will change day by day, but I think we need to keep that front in mind and not fall back on the muscle memory of just covering the day-to-day of the goings on in Washington the same way we always did.
Yeah, it raises
Natalie, do you have
awareness
a-
about the importance of giving context, and just
Yes.
thinking back to the first Trump administration, you know, and covering all of the different policy debates and things that were popping up. Journalists, we started the really important conversations and awareness about issues that maybe people weren't talking about before, but, you know, suddenly you're doing a lot of different research about the weeds of certain policies and how Washington works. And, you know, there's a positive, it's a chance for us to kind of dig in and have those conversations again, raise the awareness for the public.
Well, very good. That's a lot to think about this evening. And as I said, we're less than a week away from transition and a lot of change. So we will keep an eye on that, and we appreciate your expertise and insights and perspectives. I want to thank our audience. Again, want to thank all of our partners for making this program possible. And we will stay in touch. And all have a good evening and be safe. Thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.